Hey there guys, this is Cole. Welcome back to another movie review. Today's movie I'm going to be reviewing is Critters 2: The Main Course, the second movie in the Critters franchise. Now, essentially when the first Critters movie came out in 1986, the movie received mixed reviews from critics and audiences, but it was a big box office hit, so it got a sequel a couple years later. And the first movie was criticized as being a Gremlins ripoff, although funny story, the first movie was not technically a Gremlins ripoff because the script for Critters was actually written before before the idea for Gremlins even came out. But because Gremlins started filming first, the studio decided to hold back. New Line Cinema decided to hold back on that since Gremlins began filming before Critters began filming, although the idea for Critters came actually before there was even an idea for Gremlins. So it's technically the other way around, but Critters was the movie released after. But I actually do like the first Critters movie. Again, it's no Gremlins, but it's a fun movie, fun little creature feature. And I think the same thing about the second movie here, Critters 2: The Main Course. I think that this is a rather fun sequel. I would say I liked the first movie a little better, but I thought that this was a pretty solid sequel. So what is the plot to Critters 2: The Main Course? The plot of the movie is as follows. When two men find a bunch of exotic eggs, the critters soon hatch and unleash a hungry horde of ugly little monsters on their small Kansas town on Easter time. So that's basically the premise of this movie without giving away too much. And like I said, I thought that this was overall a pretty good sequel. Now, I don't think it's as good as the first movie, and Stephen Herrick, who directed the first movie, he didn't come back to direct this one. They got a different director, Mick Garris, who directed the made-for-TV movie Psycho 4: The Beginning, which I'm not a big fan of that movie. When it comes to the Psycho movies, when it comes to the Psycho franchise, I really like the first two movies. The third one is okay, but then Psycho 4: The Beginning, and then of course the 1998 shot-for-shot remake of Psycho was bad. And I know they did that Bates Motel prequel TV show, which heard a lot of good things about that, but I've never seen that show. But anyways, getting back to this, I thought that Mick Garris did a rather good job to it. So, the movie begins where it takes place not too long after the first movie, where our main character from the first movie, Brad, returns in the sequel. And in this movie, Brad, he decides to go visit his grandmother and stuff like that, because he wants to spend Easter with his grandma and, forget all of the critter stuff that happened. He just wants to have some normalcy to himself for a little bit. But very early on in the movie, we find out that that's not going to happen, because if you remember at the end of the first movie had a sequel tease with some critters' eggs in a barn. Well, that carries over into this movie, where this one guy and another guy, they come across both the eggs, but they don't know that it's like eggs with the alien, krites or critters in them. So they don't know that's what it is, but they figured that it would be nice to, it'd be nice to give them to kids for Easter, for the Easter egg hunt and stuff like that. So they decide to go bring it to the person in the Nan, which is basically Brad's grandma, for the Easter egg hunt, and they give it to her and stuff like that. And there's a girl early on in the movie, a little girl who comes across one of the critters' eggs, but of course, nobody knows that it's the critters' eggs and stuff like that. And she says, "Thanks, Nan," and she's like, "You're welcome." And then early on in the movie, that, the little girl, she's sleeping in bed, like her hands hanging off. Like, we think this critter that hatched out of the egg is gonna bite her hand, but that does not happen, because the dad walks into the bedroom to check on his daughter sleeping, and he accidentally steps on the critter, and he literally doesn't know that he stepped on a creature. He just thinks that it was the egg, and then he lifts up his feet and sees that there's this green slime over there, but that's really the blood from the dead creature. But anyways, what I also like about this movie is that the two bounty hunter characters from the first two movie, the two bounty hunters from the first movie actually return in this sequel. That way they can go after these krites, these critters that are wreaking havoc on the city, which I thought was a nice little way to tie in the continuity to the first movie. And I like like the first movie, this movie also does have some good dark humor to it. Like there's a scene early on in the movie there's a scene early on in the movie where the bounty hunter who disguised himself as John Steele, he's basically holding up like a Johnny Steele, he's basically holding up like a magazine with one of the bounty hunters looking at it, and then one of them turns into a woman, like a woman with no bra that's topless, at which, keep in mind, this movie is rated PG-13, so this movie definitely has some edge for a PG-13 movie, and like just the way that scene was executed I thought was pretty funny. And when the action scenes do happen in this movie, they're rather good. Like, for instance, there's a scene in this movie where the guy who's in the Easter Bunny suit that's gonna, deliver the eggs to the kids at the church on, Easter, he finds one of the hatched eggs, but he sees that it's broken with green slime in it, and he's like, what was in this thing? And then one of the critters basically jumps in, attacks him and stuff like that, and the guy basically goes flying through the window and, with his insides torn out and stuff like that. And in this movie, we are introduced to a character by the name of Megan, who she was basically like a school news reporter, like a senior, and she becomes friends with Brad in the movie. And I thought that their chemistry was good. You definitely believe the fact that they were friends, and I like Brad overall as a character. Like, for instance, early on in the movie, there's a scene where Brad, he's inside like a restaurant, like a burger joint type of thing, and there is this bully named Wesley, who is played by Tom Hodges, who is basically harassing this girl, and then Brad basically tells him, leave her alone, okay, ease off on her, and the guy's like, wait a minute, you're that Critters guy, and stuff like that, and then Brad's like, please, I don't want any trouble, and then he doesn't listen, he kicks Brad out the restaurant, and then, our main character, Brad, and Megan picks him up in the truck and gives him a ride, and, and she's like, wait a minute, you're that Critters guy, right? And then, and he's like, no, there's no such thing as that, trying to convince her that he was not that person. And then I like the part where he says something rather dirty, but then she looks at him. Like, I thought that scene was funny. And I like how with this movie, they definitely upped the ante. They pretty much took everything that worked in the first movie, but they just expanded upon it, and just now, I guess I don't think this movie is quite as good as the first movie, just because I think the first movie had a better story with the family dynamic, but I think that this is a rather good sequel because it upped the ante and it upped the stakes, which I definitely appreciate that. And I like the part where Brad and Megan decide to go to his grandma's house, and the grandma basically sees one of the critters is eating her food in the fridge. The grandma freaks out, closes the door, and then Brad runs in saying there's critters, and she's like, no crap, like, help me out with this and stuff. And then eventually, Brad is able to get the remote that, if you remember at the end of the first movie, was the remote to call the bounty hunter, and he basically makes one of the critters, or the krites, explode. And then the bounty hunter, who was disguised as that Johnny Steele character from the first movie, walks into the place, and then, Brad introduces the bounty hunters to his grandma and stuff like that. And like I said, the action scenes are really good in this movie. Like, I like the part where about halfway into the movie where the bounty hunter disguised as Johnny Steele, and then the one disguised as Lee, which, if you don't know who Lee is, it was the bounty hunter who disguised himself as the woman that I mentioned earlier. And I like the part where they basically have a shotgun and they're just blasting the critters in the restaurant left and right who are eating all the food, and I like the part where where Lee, like, she shoots a machine gun but like accidentally knocks off some of the gremlins hair. No, not the gremlins, the critters hair, and he says BITCHING, and then she blasts a shotgun, and then the critter falls in the in a fryer pan and a boiler. So yeah. And then I like the part where the restaurant blows up, and then the manager of the restaurant's upset, hey, what, can't you, like, he's like, who's gonna pay for all this damage? And actually, the actor who plays the manager of the restaurant, Hungry Heifer Manger, is actually, now, funny enough, the manager of this restaurant is actually played by Eddie Deezen, who, if you don't know who that is, now, if you don't know who that is, he voiced the character Know-It-All in the family Christmas movie, The Polar Express, which is one of my favorite Christmas movies, so it was nice to see him in this movie. And I really like the finale at the end of this movie where Brad and, and everyone, they're trying to fight off all the critters, but of course, the critters are smart. A bunch of the critters roll up into this giant ball, and that pretty much consumes anything that comes across their path. Like, for instance, one of them, rolls over a person, and, they eat the person, and the only thing left is their skeleton. And I like the whole finale where the bounty hunter, who is disguised as Charlie, who was a character in the first movie that, that Brad was good friends with, the bounty hunter disguises him because, you find out in this movie that you basically find out that Charlie's a bounty hunter. I like the part where he sacrifices himself at the end of this movie by running his machine into the critters, and then they all blow up. And then, I forgot to mention this, but, the bounty hunter by the name of, who disguised himself as Johnny, lost his face appearance in the movie. He lost his transformation because he was upset that, Lee, one of his bounty hunter friends, was not so lucky to survive. But then at the end of the movie, that bounty hunter disguised as the singer Johnny, he transforms his face into Charlie, who just sacrificed himself. And then, everyone's happy. And then at the end of the movie, he leaves planet Earth. And then, yeah, the movie ends on a good note. So, yeah. At the end of the day, I thought that this was a rather solid sequel. Not as good as the first movie, but I overall liked it. Next up, I'm going to be reviewing Critters 3, which I'm not a big fan of that movie, and that's when the franchise started to go downhill, and then I'll review 4 and 5, but we'll go from there. And on a scale of 1 to 10, I'll give Critters 2, the main course, an 8 out of 10. The same score I gave the first movie. So, yeah. Thank you guys so much for watching my review, and I'll see you guys later. Bye-bye.